Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chairman Scott and Commissioners. My name is CJ Prudhomme. I'm the Chief Legal and Regulatory Officer for Xplornet Communications Inc. I'm joined by my Xplornet colleagues to my immediate right, Tim Dennison, who is Xplornet's Chief Technology Officer, and to my left is Carl McQuarrie, and on the far right is Cheryl Bernato, who is our Vice President for Xplore Mobile. We are pleased to be here today and to participate in this important proceeding. Xplornet is a champion for rural connectivity in Canada. We proudly serve those Canadians who choose to live outside the cities. Bringing fast, affordable broadband to rural Canada is more than just our business, it's our purpose. Over the last 15 years, we have become one of Canada's largest facilities-based operators. From our beginnings in the town of Woodstock, New Brunswick, we have rapidly grown our reach, with investments now totaling over $1.5 billion. We have built a national network spanning the second largest landmass country in the world. Today, we are proud to connect approximately 1 million rural Canadians located in every province and territory of Canada. And we remain proudly headquartered in Woodstock. The communities we serve share a common element. They are rural areas of the country that have been underserved by the incumbent service providers and needed better service. We have made it our mission to connect rural Canadians using the latest technology, including wireless, satellite, and fiber. We're now offering speeds of 50 megabits per second with unlimited data on our fixed wireless network, and with plans to increase those speeds to 100 megabits per second. We're introducing fiber to the home services in parts of the country and launching the next generation Jupiter 3 satellite to enable download speeds of 100 megabits per second, with unlimited data to our satellite customers by 2022. We are preparing to launch 5G wireless in rural Canada on the same timeline as is being launched in the urban centers. The success of our business has been based on careful and deliberate planning. Delivering service in traditionally underserved rural areas comes with many challenges that must be overcome. The most obvious challenge is geography. Another is cost. Canadians are not only demanding high-quality services, but rather high-quality, affordable services. While we are proud of what we have accomplished to date, there is always more work to be done to deliver the latest technologies at affordable prices. At Xplornet, we enjoy talking about our experience in rural fixed broadband, but that's not the focus of why we're here today. We're here today to share our experience operating Canada's newest wireless service provider, Xplore Mobile. We launched Xplore Mobile in November of 2018, serving customers in the province of Manitoba. Just like with fixed broadband services, we believe that there are many Canadians in areas of the country that may not be the focus of Canada's mobile service providers. These Canadians are looking for a simple, fair, and transparent wireless provider. They want access to the latest technologies and affordable prices. Xplore Mobile was born out of a desire to answer the demands of those Canadians. The record of this proceeding has echoed our beliefs. Many parties have told the Commission that Canadians want more competitive choices. We have heard that. Canadians benefit from more affordable service offerings in areas of the country where there is a strong regional mobile provider operating alongside the three national providers. While many Canadians have access to high-quality, affordable mobile wireless services, it's clear there's more work to be done. As a new entrant in the mobile marketplace, we will not pretend to have all the answers, because we do not. However, we would be happy to share some of our experiences with you. And with that, I'd like to turn over the mic to Cheryl, who heads our Xplore Mobile operations.
As CJ stated a moment ago, at Xplore Mobile, it is our goal to bring new competitive choice to Canadians, and we are making significant investments to build and expand our mobile network to make this happen. As a new entrant, however, it is difficult to compete in the mobile marketplace. We would like to start by highlighting a few changes that the Commission could make to its existing regulatory regime that would help us overcome some of the challenges we face. If you were to ask us what our #1 change the Commission could make to the regulatory framework for mobile wireless services would be. It would be to revise the rates associated with domestic roaming services of the national providers. We know it is not part of the present proceeding. However, we need to stress how much impact these rates are having on our business. It is incredibly difficult for us to bring more affordable wireless offerings to Canadians because the wholesale roaming rates we have to pay are so much higher than the retail rates in the marketplace. In Manitoba, we are competing against plans from national providers that offer 10 gigabytes of data for $65 a month. Assuming that this $65 were allocated entirely to data, which of course it isn't because plans offer many other features than data. These plans are charging a maximum of $6.50 per gigabyte of data. In contrast, the wholesale rates set out for domestic roaming tariffs of the national providers are between $13 and $14 per gigabyte, more than double the amounts being charged by the national providers at retail. Because of these high roaming rates, we are challenged in creating attractive plans for our customers. In order to make our plans as affordable as possible, we have currently structured our plans to include voice, text, and data usage only within Manitoba. If a customer wants to use data, text, or make voice calls from outside Manitoba, this usage incurs additional charges. Manitobans have told us they do not want regional plans like this. They want national coverage at one price. This is our #1 complaint we receive from our customers. We are looking for solutions to address this, and the Commission can help us. In order for us to offer affordable offerings for Manitobans, we encourage the Commission to revise the roaming rates to ensure they evolve with retail rates. As a company that is facilities-based by nature, we recognize this is not one-sided, and roaming rates must strike a balance between being reasonable for those roaming and fair to those providing the roaming. In that context, we believe that a fair and balanced data roaming rate would be in the range of $3 to $5 per gigabyte.
The second regulatory change we would ask the Commission to address relates to network quality. We are currently investing to build a state-of-the-art, fully IP-based LTE network. This network will be the first of its kind in Canada and one of the highest quality LTE networks in the world. However, despite this investment, because the domestic roaming services of the national providers do not provide us with service parity, we are challenged to compete on quality in the marketplace. One example of service parity is seamless handoff, a subject we've talked quite a bit about this afternoon. Without seamless handoff, our customers experience drop connections whenever they transition from our network to the network of a roaming partner. It is the equivalent of an electronic ring fence around a regional provider's network. If a customer steps outside this fence, their connection immediately drops. Drop connections are frustrating for customers and bad for business. Canadians don't care how high quality the network is that we are building if being our customer means their calls are going to drop. It's a terrible service experience. In our view, seamless handoff is critical for us to effectively build our business. Today, without seamless handoff, when we want to expand into a new area, we must build a significant amount of network before we can begin offering service. If we deploy service with only a small degree of coverage, our customers are going to need to transition between our network and the network of a roaming partner too frequently. The frequent drop connections will be extremely frustrating for our customers and damage our brand. Because of this, we can't afford to start selling service in a new area until we have a significant degree of coverage. This challenges the business case for expanding our network to serve new areas. With seamless handoff, we can begin selling to customers as we roll out coverage to a new community. We don't have to wait until we have a significant footprint to begin offering our services. Seamless handoff would allow us to start earning revenue while investing, thereby greatly reducing the barriers we face in expanding our business. The national providers have argued that seamless handoff is not necessary or that it's too complex to implement. We do not agree with these arguments. Seamless handoff is a key functionality that should be incorporated as part of the mandated domestic roaming service, and the technical implementation is entirely possible. The Commission should ensure that the wholesale wireless framework does not serve to undermine the investments being made by regional operators. Domestic roaming must provide service parity to regional providers. In addition to mandating seamless handoff, we ask that the Commission confirm that domestic roaming services are to apply to all existing and future wireless technologies.
Thirdly, we echo concerns raised by other parties in the proceeding about access to passive infrastructure. In particular, we believe that the Commission should consider changes that could reduce barriers for regional wireless service providers. We agree that there should be limits on how incumbents can reserve capacity on support structures for future use. Support structures are a public good, and space on these structures should be allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. Incumbents should not be permitted to unduly reserve capacity for their own use, delaying competitors from expanding their networks, or forcing competitors to incur make-ready charges. We also agree that small cells should be treated as strand equipment. Permits should not be required to place small cells on strand. By reducing these barriers for access to support structures, the Commission can support regional service providers in expanding their coverage and capacity more quickly to serve more Canadians. Other proposals have been made that can assist all parties in deploying their networks. For example, parties have promoted the development of a streamlined process at the Commission to help service providers and public authorities quickly resolve questions around terms of access to rights-of-way in public places. Parties have also made proposals to facilitate the placement of 5G equipment, such as small cells on public property. We encourage the Commission to consider these proposals.
The changes Cheryl, Tim, and Carl have described would go a long way to resolving some of the biggest barriers Xplore Mobile faces in growing our business. In addition to these changes, we would like to comment on a potential MVNO service. We are a facilities-based provider, and we believe in facilities-based competition. We don't support the introduction of an MVNO service that would enable a pure resale model in the wireless marketplace. However, the Competition Bureau has proposed a carefully thought-out MVNO service that we believe could help empower Canadian regional providers to reach more Canadians over the next 5 years. With a few modifications that we're happy to talk about, we support the introduction of this service. Under the Competition Bureau's proposal, service providers who will deploy their own radio access network in a new area would be able to subscribe to an MVNO service for a period of 5 years in order to serve that area while they build out their own network. We believe that this service represents an appropriate intervention to stimulate competition. This service is designed to give regional providers a boost in expanding their networks. It hastens the speed at which regional providers are able to roll out their spectrum while promoting facilities-based competition. We would recommend only 2 changes to the Competition Bureau's proposal. In relation to our first change, we agree with the MVNO service should be temporary. The Competition Bureau has proposed that a regional provider who subscribes to the service would be required to transition its customers to its own network at the end of 5 years. We would recommend a slightly more flexible approach. We believe that a regional provider should be permitted to use the MVNO service to sell to new customers for a period of 5 years. After the 5 years, the regional provider would be permitted to continue serving its customer, but no longer be permitted to sell service to new customers. We believe this change would enable regional providers to more broadly leverage the MVNO service to reach even more Canadians. With respect to our second change, we believe the Bureau's proposal could be simplified. The Bureau has proposed an enforcement mechanism that contemplates fines for not deploying facilities. We do not think the Commission needs to implement an enforcement regime of this nature. The regional providers have already made large investments to acquire spectrum needed to serve the areas in question. The spectrum comes with its own deployment conditions. By acquiring spectrum, regional providers have already demonstrated their commitment to deploying in an area. With these changes, we support the MVNO service proposed by the Competition Bureau. While an MVNO service for a limited time is something we support, we also believe that the changes Cheryl, Tim, and Carl described a moment ago are critical to allow new entrants to continue to be successful, especially as they launch their own network and move off of the MVNO arrangement. To summarize, in order to help new entrants like Xplornet Mobile overcome the barriers we face in bringing new competitive choices to Canadians, we would encourage the Commission to make the following changes to its regulatory framework. The Commission should take steps to address the rates associated with the mandatory domestic roaming service. Wholesale rates should evolve with retail rates. Today, fair rates for data should be in the range of $3 to $5 per gigabyte. Number two, the Commission should ensure that domestic roaming services do not undermine the investment that regional providers are making. Roaming services should provide for seamless handoff and should apply to all current and future technologies. And number three, the Commission should ensure that competitors have timely access to support structures and public places to expand their networks. Further to this, we would support the introduction of the MVNO service proposed by the Competition Bureau with the few modifications that we proposed. This service would provide a kickstart for a new entrant in deploying to new areas and still require an evolution to become a facility-based provider, all while bringing new competitive offers to Canadians. We would like to thank the Commission for meeting with us today, and we're pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you for your submission. Commissioner Levy.
Good afternoon. Just before we begin, for those who are not entirely familiar with the scope of your mobile wireless offerings, and for any in the room who might be from Manitoba and from rural Manitoba and might be potential customers, can you just take a moment to fill us in on what your service looks like, what you offer, what your value proposition is?
Well, I can take the first part of that, and I'll ask Cheryl to take the second. So we are a rural internet service provider in Manitoba. We have a very extensive deployment in that province and a sizable customer base. We have augmented that by going into the mobile business recently, and we have tried to, I'm not going to hopefully misspeak and say how we position it, but we've tried to come in with some innovative offers that allow us to position ourselves slightly differently from the big three. And I'll let Cheryl describe them.
Thank you, CJ. In Manitoba, we're focused on providing services to Manitobans, and we've tried to come with offer as bringing forward something new. So we did bring in the data rollover concept to add value for customers, and this concept is to allow customers to bring their unused data from the previous month forward and be able to use it in the following month. Along with that, we have a varied sets of plans ranging from $35 to $65 a month with various levels of gigabytes of data, and including unlimited voice and unlimited SMS.
Thank you. Some of the information on your pricing was not captured in some of the data that staff had collected, so I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to put some of that on the record, and we will be discussing a little bit more of it as we go on. In your interventions, you of course have talked about the positive impact that regional carriers have had on the retail mobile wireless market in Canada, and in particular in Manitoba. Are the prices of mobile wireless services still high in Canada, in your view, in certain regions of Canada, and if so, where, compared to domestic or international benchmarks?
I would say that as compared to what we see in countries like the United States, we still have a higher rate of charges for our service plans in Canada. We do see the regional variations, as the Competition Bureau talked about this morning, in areas that do have a fourth player or a regional disruptor, and we do see that sense of competition in Manitoba, as we do see that competition there and that ongoing price drivers as we look at different offers that come to market, and some that are only available within the stores as opposed to visible online.
Okay. Do you consider, would you agree with the study commissioned by TELUS from Dr. Dupont? He concluded that Canadian mobile wireless prices are actually now below international benchmarks. So I think you might have a bone to pick with him on that one.
Well, we said that we would come here and try to answer your questions. Explore Mobile is not the expert in the international evidence. We focus on identifying market opportunities to reach Canadians who need new options. So we are out there to identify people that we can provide a better level of service to. I don't think we're as well prepared to speak about how that relates to service in other countries.
Okay, so you've said before that you feel that the mobile wireless market is competitive in Manitoba, largely as a result of your presence as an extra regional carrier?
I think a lot of it has to do with actually history of the legacy of MTS in Manitoba. And I think that the timeframes that were examined by the Competition Bureau were timeframes that MTS was operating in Manitoba, but we do see the legacy of that. And with the addition of bringing Explore Mobile in right after, still a sense of additional competition in the area.
So do you, I take your point that you're not experts on the international market, but as you look at the Canadian market, where do you see the points of most competition and the places where there seems to be a robust market?
Well, we are certainly of the view there is a robust competition in Manitoba. We may have referenced the fact we are very focused and deliberate in what we do, and that's what we are focused and deliberate on right now is Manitoba. We don't operate outside of that province.
But you have operations across the country, so you
Yeah.
must have a sense of where there might be future opportunities.
True enough, yes, in some way, shape, or form. We are a rural-based provider, though, so please keep in mind that is probably indicative of what we're thinking in terms of our future approach. And it is, again, where we think we can provide value where there isn't a lot of other infrastructure that might be available. So without giving away where we might want to go to our competitors in a public forum, we have identified a few other areas where there might be opportunities. We are not necessarily interested in rushing to the lowest possible place. So it probably won't surprise Videotron that we don't think it's appropriate to necessarily start there.
Okay. For the next few questions, I'm going to refer to the material that we collected in our exhibits on the pricing across the country, the price survey that was conducted by the Commission. Based on these publicly posted prices, it appears that the prices charged by the national Big Three and by the national MNOs in Quebec are now lower than elsewhere in Canada, including Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where prices had been historically lower compared to other provinces. Do you have any opinion as to why mobile wireless prices charged by the national MNOs are now lower in Quebec?
We can only truly speak to our internet experience in Quebec, which has traditionally been a more price-sensitive province. And in that context, and this is pure speculation on our part because we're certainly not wireless mobile experts in Quebec, But if that purchasing pattern is similar between internet and wireless, the people of Quebec tend to be price conscious and they tend to shop.
More price conscious than Manitobans.
It would appear.
Hard to believe. How can we explain that prices in Saskatchewan and Manitoba seem to differ from those in other provinces for the larger plans only? That seems to be the only place where, if you look at the data, there's any real differences.
Interesting question, slightly speculative on our part, but one might argue it comes back to the theme we mentioned and Cheryl started with, which is the cost of roaming. Where you have a regional provider like us who is somewhat dependent upon roaming as people move outside of areas, it is extraordinarily difficult to offer the bigger gigabyte plans. So we are probably less effective as a competitor in that circumstance than we would be in the smaller ones.
There's a study commissioned by Bell Mobility from Charles Rivers and Associates, and it concludes that differences in prices across provinces aren't due to a lack of competition, but rather reflect differences in network quality. Do you think that that's the case?
I don't believe that we would share that opinion entirely, no.
Now, I take it that you're in a small market. Do you vary your prices from one community to another based on what else might be offered in that community, or you tend to be fairly uniform?
Do you want me to? I can. We price for Manitoba, and that largely has to do with media and effective buying on that part. But as Cheryl alluded to, we do face even store-level competition where a specific mall or a specific location will offer something special, and we have to respond.
And you do.
On a very specific basis. It's usually not at a full price point level. It's usually a promotion, a limited time offer of some sort, a promotional discount, say on a set amount off of your bill for a few months. So those types of promotional offers, but not a varied change in your actual pricing.
Okay. There's been a discussion about whether profitability is a good indicator to assess competition in the mobile wireless market. What do you think is the most appropriate measure of profitability, especially given how capital intensive the business is?
I'm not sure we have a view on that.
You'll know when you get there.
Yes, I was trying to think of a polite way to say that, but yes. We are obviously, we're a private company. We don't make our financial information public, but it will not surprise anyone that we are obviously losing money at 14 months into the launch.
What are your biggest challenges to expanding your customer base?
I think the answer to that is, Cheryl, go ahead.
I think it goes back to what we talked about earlier. Its ability to offer our customers two things, different types of affordable Canadian-wide plans that are somewhat tied to the issue of the data roaming rates that we spoke about, as well as the seamless handoff and the customer experience as they exit and enter territories that we would have in our current deployment, as well as future rural areas that we would establish.
Certain parties, for instance, TELUS, have talked about the cost of spectrum in Canada, and they say that it's higher than in other jurisdictions. Do you agree with this view? And can you talk a little bit about what your experience has been with regard to spectrum?
We agree it's expensive. This has been one of the great challenges of Xplornet, certainly on its broadband side, and we would agree we certainly see it on the mobile side as well, particularly because the spectrums are increasingly, it's a flexible use and is used on both sides of the business. It is indeed one of the biggest expenditures that you make in terms of trying to build your network and have enough I think as one of my colleagues put it, oxygen in the network to breathe.
Can you talk about how it affects your bottom line? Perhaps by giving us an example of how it affects your mobile wireless prices or your company profitability.
I think I'm going to let Tim explain a little bit, and we would probably echo some of the comments Shaw made. Having more spectrum helps reduce your capital expenditure. So.
Yeah, taking into consideration not just the absolute cost of spectrum licenses, depending on the business that you're in and the value of that spectrum, there is a substitution cost for buying more spectrum versus building more sites and cell splitting to develop more network capacity given a certain topology. So there is a trade-off for us when we're doing capital planning, the value of spectrum versus structure or construction replacement costs, call it that. How that factors into our thinking in terms of pricing, not directly. We think more in terms of what kind of investments do we need to make to develop the network capabilities to support the product promise with the number of customers that we're trying to ultimately bring onto the network. And then over to product and marketing and other types of discussions in terms of how to develop that into revenue generating plans. So spectrum, absolute requirement, licensed spectrum, even more so. There's different ways to value it depending on where you are in the life cycle of your business, what kind of products you're trying to offer. And in terms of parity with international jurisdictions, all of that's on public record. I'd invite you to do some investigation.
How do you measure how much spectrum you have and how much you need?
So two requirements when we're developing mobile networks. One is to make sure we've got sufficient coverage to ensure that we're covering the population we want to address, covering the terrain, making sure that we've got sufficient coverage along major transportation routes and other folks that are outside of urban centers. For that purpose, lower band spectrum is of more interest because you can get much better propagation than you can out of higher band. So that's the topology of coverage. When you're in urban centers or where people are more and more static or high transportation traffic corridors, you need to start worrying about capacity. And that's where particularly data capacity at peak, which is where mid-band spectrum is more useful to us. It's shorter propagation, but you're able to, if I can oversimplify, jam more information into a given band of spectrum. So really when we're designing networks for both coverage and peak capacity, you need to take into account the flavor of the spectrum and where you want to put the radio equipment.
Is the network access agreement between your company and Bell that was part of the 2017 consent agreement with the Competition Bureau allowing Bell to purchase MTS, is that still in effect?
Yes, it is at this point.
Let's follow up a little bit more on some of your comments about roaming. Have you approached any of the national MNOs to negotiate a seamless roaming arrangement?
Yes.
Can you expand a little bit on what that process looked like and how things went?
Let's put it this way. I think I understood exactly what the people at Shaw were saying earlier, and we likely had the exact same experience. It was a short conversation.
What were the nature of the stumbling blocks, the wall that you hit? What was the problem?
Well, I think they actually described it quite well. It's the issue that comes down to we want something, and they have incentives not to give it to us. And there's not really much to trade in that economic circumstance where you have a prescribed roaming rate already, and it's a particularly high one. So there aren't a lot of trade-offs there that you can make.
Similarly, have you tried to negotiate a network sharing agreement with the national MNOs and other regional carriers?
We have had conversations, yes.
And same results?
Yes.
Okay. You talked as well about access to support structures. Do you have specific issues with regard to access to the national MNOs, towers, and support structures?
So in our opening remarks, we made some comments that we want to facilitate access to these structures. We're speaking mostly from a policy perspective at this point. Our broadband business has been largely leveraging traditional macro towers that are regulated under the ISED regime, and we're not asking the Commission to make any changes to that regime. When it comes to ILEC support structures, poles and conduits, we are getting more into that now that we are deploying fiber into our network. And I wouldn't say that we've had any specific problems yet because it's quite new to us. But we understand the comments that other parties have made, and we support the recommendations that they're making as good policy.
With respect to access to spectrum, just to go back to that, to what extent does it constitute barriers to entry or prevent you from growing your business?
That's a great question. Spectrum is a scarce resource, and everybody wants it, for exactly the reasons Tim has just described, because it is that trade-off with the capital process. So it has been a challenge in the 15 years of Xplornet to accumulate the spectrum portfolio that we have. It is disheartening when part of that was taken away last year as a result of the 3500 decision. That was a very difficult day, as I'm sure you can imagine, for Xplornet. So yes, in answer to your question, there are definitely challenges. Is it possible? I guess we're living proof that it's possible. Is it hard? Yes.
Shaw indicated in paragraph 34 of its submission on the 15th of May, 2019, that the national MNOs are incented and able to foreclose new competitors from gaining access to the spectrum they need to compete. Do you think the national MNOs are intentionally not using spectrum they buy in order to keep it from competitors?
I can't comment as to their motivation. We can only comment to the experience of what we've seen. Certainly, with respect to some of the more recent acquisitions, we have seen deployment of that spectrum, very expensive spectrum that they purchased. There's also the legacy, though, of the 3500, which went more than 10 years undeployed. So it's an interesting question. I don't understand the difference in policy between the spectrum.
Do you have any evidence to support some of the evidence that you've just given?
Well, it's a matter of public record.
The public record.
It is a matter of public record regarding the use of the 3500 hearing that was that ISED had.
Shaw talked about the larger MNOs having the ability to essentially overpay for spectrum in order to keep it out of the hands of those who don't have the same kind of resources. Do you have any sense that that's happening?
Well, our experience is a little bit different because of what we do. They are focused on urban and the concentration of people within a license area, such as a Tier 4. You've heard people speak about the Tier 4 license areas. Those are a combination, when you get near the cities, of both urban and rural. And rough cut, but we could go through any given city you'd like, but roughly 80% of the population is on 20% of the landmass. The other 80% has the 20% of the population. We're interested in the 20% of the population. They're interested in the 80%. Economics say that they can pay more because they have more people to potentially serve. That is the problem we run up against more frequently than them trying to keep us out. It's just a different focus in our experience.
You particularly target rural areas for high-speed internet. Are there specific challenges that the Commission should consider when developing its mobile wireless policy in this proceeding?
We've had a lot of conversation about that because A lot of the focus is on urban and the urban prices associated with that. And I think someone earlier today even referenced that the goal is sort of for service providers makes it work in urban, and then they sort of backed off and said, well, we're not sure that's true in rural. And really the question is, it's very rare to find four deployed infrastructures out in rural. But that doesn't mean there isn't a need for it, and it doesn't mean that there isn't a demand for it. But what we would perhaps suggest to the Commission is one size does not fit all in the solution that you seek here to find, and urban and rural may be different in terms of how you approach it.
And how much ubiquity actually works
Yes.
to sponsor competition. Okay.
Absolutely.
Can you explain whether ARPU is an appropriate proxy for prices?
ARPU is how we manage our business and look at it, so yes.
Okay. To what extent are your medium, long-term investment plans sensitive or dependent on your level of profitability? I can't imagine that's
Highly.
that it isn't highly. You are in other lines of business, such as broadband and wireline services. And do those subsidize your investments in the infrastructure that you use to offer the whole range of services, not just wireless?
At this time, the answer to that is yes. Obviously, to the extent we can make use of some of the broadband infrastructure that we use, that's helpful. But we do look at the mobile business as a standalone, and we do expect it to someday stand on its own, and that's important to us.
According to a survey filed by the province of British Columbia, the vast majority, like 86% of respondents, did not consider the cost of their wireless service to be reasonable. And this view was echoed by many who participated in this proceeding. In your view, what best explains these sentiments that mobile wireless services are not affordable?
Also a great question, and probably speculative on our part to try and guess as to what that is. It could certainly be one part comparing to what we see in the U.S., and one part, after a while, we've been told it's uneconomic for years, or that it's too high, without necessarily appreciating the differences between countries. But as Carl said, we're not international experts, so we can't really speak to specifics on that.
How do you promote your lower cost plans? You said that you have a range of $35 to $65. So do you promote those lower cost plans in a similar fashion? How do you know what works and what doesn't?
We promote all our plans equally. They're all available on our website, in all of our advertising materials, and in all of our store promotional information and all of our brochures. We don't treat any of our plans differently. So between $35 and $65, they're all equally available. The only distinction that we have is on handsets, that some of our higher handset tabs, we use the tab model for handset pricing, meaning that we very clearly and transparently show the customer their service cost and their handset cost. That we do limit for the higher tabs that they must be on a minimum of the $45 plan.
Okay. The idea of this data rollover is quite innovative, I think, in Canada. What was the impact? Is it something that customers talk about? Is it something that you highlight because it is a different kind of offering?
Yes, and from our value proposition perspective, it is a key part of our value proposition. And again, back to our fair and transparent aspect of our brand, driving that the customer bought the data, they're obligated to be able to use that data and carry that forward for 1 month. And so it gives customers that certainty. I think that they like that ability to say, hey, I paid for it, I didn't use it, I get to keep it for the next month. and it gives me a little bit of a buffer. So they see a value in that.
Do you offer both prepaid and postpaid
We do
plans?
not. We offer postpaid only at this
Postpaid
time.
only, okay. And does your advertising for some of the plans at the lower cost end, do they target specific segments of the population? For instance, do you target seniors in particular, or people who are helping out seniors who want them to be connected for?
Yeah. Due to allocating of our media spend, our media is quite generic. So again, propagates all of our plans, all of our general offerings in one message to all Manitobans that we cover in Winnipeg and Brandon. So we don't target market in that way at this time.
How do you respond to customers who come in? How do you assess? How do you train your people to assess what a customer's needs are, so that you can tailor the offering to their needs?
Sure. We have a needs assessment process that our reps are trained in and that they go through with the customer, asking them about their habits, their uses, their needs around voice, text, and data to understand what they need in their current environment. We also usually ask what they currently have to understand what they have today, and what we also inquire as to what they do or don't like about the plan or service that they have today. And then from there, it's the reps are trained to give them a best fit or give them options and explain those options and what benefits they have at the different price points. We also allow our customers to change service if it's not meeting their needs, and whether that is an upgrade or a downgrade, they're allowed to do so.
It sort of comes up later in my list of questions, but I might as well ask now about the whole issue of win-backs, which we talked about with some of the earlier, with our earlier intervener. Is this an issue for you?
I would say that we haven't seen, I think due to our time frame in the environment, we have not seen the large targeted win-back experience that was described by Shaw. And as far as some of our reporting mechanisms yet are probably a little junior and don't have that detailed level of tracking at this time to really have a sense of that. I haven't heard our reps. We have regular meetings, and our reps have not complained that customers are receiving calls in the store while they're in the process of migrating. We haven't seen that experience.
Okay. Could you file your training manuals or other documents to show how you train your sales reps with respect to your plans and so forth?
Sure.
To make that understood. Thank you. Some parties have suggested that the Commission mandate low-cost plans that would be available to limited means-tested segments of the population, such as low and fixed-income households. To what extent do you think that would be feasible for you?
I would start with the view that I think there are a lot of the low cost out there, similar to what Shaw said. We do see a lot of low cost already out there. I'm not sure that mandating it will improve that beyond what are already out there. The types of $10 and $15 plans that exist that are voice and text only, or only a small 50 minutes of voice, small bucket of text. At this time, we have our plans are unlimited at a voice and text level, and we would not offer any services that did not include some level of data because we are an LTE-only network. So
you would then be against offering such plans, or?
I wouldn't be
that
against,
we
no.
mandate such plans?
We strive to make our plans affordable and available to our customers. At this point in time, our plans start at the $35 rate.
ISED had a program called Connecting Families, which was referenced earlier, and it was meant to connect low-income Canadian families to the internet by offering a very low-cost internet $10 service to eligible families, and they were selected as those who got the maximum amount of the Canada Child benefit. Do you think that a similar approach could be taken for mobile wireless services?
We actually have some concerns with that program, and Xplornet did not choose to participate. The concern was in setting how they were trying to address this, they didn't take into consideration the difference between urban and rural. And that, someone making, to use a wild number, 100,000 in downtown Ottawa or downtown Toronto might have a very different lifestyle than someone making, say, 60 or 50,000 in rural. So there wasn't really this recognition of the differences that exist. So we were concerned that that program, a great intention, just it fit one problem but not the other. It wasn't quite built for rural, shall we say.
How did it miss the mark?
Well, certainly, as described to us, some of the qualifications were based on income. And at one point, one of the numbers that they had floated, which would produce a very, very small number of urban people, that was, I think, less than 10% of the population in urban, would have covered over 65% of rural. So that would have obviously resulted in a material reprice of the rural base, and as we said, didn't take into consideration that you can live very well in rural on less income.
Similarly, TELUS has the program Mobility for Good that offers a free phone and a $0 plan for 2 years to people under 26 who've been part of the child welfare system. I know you don't offer anything like that, but is that perhaps the kind of program that might be considered?
I think at this stage we're trying very hard to get our network up and running, and while we definitely have good intentions, I think those will probably come after we can say we've got to the point where we've spent all our money on the network and got it up and running appropriately.
Okay. Data overage charges have been subject to criticism and complaints in the past. And there's been a move to try to address that. Why is a gigabyte of overage data priced so differently from a gigabyte of data included in a plan limit?
In regards to the pricing, I think that the gigabyte in the plan has been discounted in order to build out the plan, and then for people who go into the overage, they're recouping a much higher rate in that data overage. And I think that by and large, that people buy plans that will make sure that they don't go into their overage so that they have that buffer, right? From our perspective, how we tried to assist in this area is by the data rollover, ensuring that you can continue to have your data that you've already paid for as a part of your plan in the future months, in the next month.
We're just going to go back briefly to meeting the needs of customers, vulnerable or not. Some sales channels are self-serving, like purely online. What tools do you offer your customers to help them assess which plans you offer will best meet their needs?
On our online and website, we do offer them ability to choose their plan, and if they're wanting to purchase a phone, choose their phone and see what that would look like on a monthly basis for them so that they can do some assessment prior to coming into a store. So that modeling is available for them to do self-serve.
And you make it clear that the bills are going to separate out what the cost is of
Yes, there are
each.
two separate individual components to the pricing, and it's clearly laid out for them.
We're going to talk a little bit about wholesale services now. In their submissions, the Bureau suggested that you would likely be in a good position to take advantage of their proposed facilities-based MVNO access model, given your 600 megahertz spectrum. Would you consider offering a retail-based MVNO service if you qualified for wholesale MVNO access? I know that you've addressed it, but just think about it.
Well, we were pleasantly surprised to hear the Bureau thought we would be excited about that this morning. It's, as we said at the outset, our mindset and our bias is we're facilities-based. The prospect of reseller opportunity has not been of interest to us in any area, whether it's mobile or wireline or anything of that nature. In part because of where we serve, there aren't a lot of other facilities, and we see the opportunity to build those facilities. Could an MVNO help accelerate our process? I think what we're trying to say is yes, on a RAN access basis, MVNO, because it allows us, as we start to build out a specific area, to potentially start to market in a much bigger area so that we can build into that in the 5-year plan.
So how could the Commission ensure that network investment continues at the same or an accelerated pace if regional carriers are incented to or encouraged to get involved in this?
Well, we very much agree with those suggesting that there should be a spectrum component, that you should definitely have that. Those have build requirements in them to deploy, and those are pretty big incentives because as you asked the question off the top about is it really expensive, is spectrum? Yes, we are definitely not in the business of warehousing spectrum. That would be an incredibly expensive thing to do. If we buy it, we need to deploy it.
How would a sunset clause affect your thinking? Is that a deal breaker, or does the 5 years seem like a reasonable time?
We actually thought the 5 years was a reasonable time, and we do think there should be a sunset. This should not be forever. It should not be a dependency. It's an opportunity to kickstart, to get going. Our only concern, and the reason why we suggested the little tweak, was if you take on the challenge of saying, I'm going to go into this area, I'm going to try it out, I'm going to start marketing in that area, I'm going to start building, and you discover it doesn't turn out to be a financially successful outcome. What we were worried about was not so much us, but the customer. We just didn't want the customer to fall off the cliff at the end of the 5 years. As long as they're still connected, that's the important thing to us. The fact that we couldn't continue to market as an MVNO, that's appropriate. Like, that should stop at the end of the 5 years.
You mentioned earlier that you had some areas where you were thinking about expanding. This might be an opportune time to ask you whether you would undertake to provide us with your plans for your spectrum, for your 600 megahertz, and how that might be impacted by the Competition Bureau's proposal for MVNOs. You can do that as a confidential undertaking, and would you be prepared to do that?
I don't think we would be prepared at this time to do so.
Okay. It would, as I say, it can be a confidential undertaking.
We understand.
All right. Are there any areas that are covered by your spectrum but where you've not yet deployed? And I guess this is the same. This is sort of the same part of the same kind of question. But I'll ask you again whether you would be prepared to make a confidential undertaking.
Well,
to let us know what those are.
Well, I think that's actually a slightly different question because we do have other spectrum in Manitoba, for example, that is not yet deployed because we're working on that. So I think if your question is to confidentially tell you where it is where we'd like to turn up or might have plans to turn up, that's something we could probably do in confidence. Okay.
And our legal department will remind us of these undertakings. The deadline is March the 10th. I would assume that the reason that you haven't built into some of those areas yet is because of the age of the undertaking and the resources that it takes to get there.
This is a very expensive proposition to build out, and yes, it takes time.
So you sound as though the Competition Bureau's wholesale MVNO notion is very attractive. to you?
I don't know that we would say it's very attractive. It presents an opportunity.
Yes. So, and that opportunity would be to get you to places where you can't
Right.
get to right now in a way that allows you to make money while you're building out.
Right. We look at it as an opportunity to accelerate the process as opposed to a wholesale, oh, we're going to go here, but we wouldn't have otherwise gone there. That's not, but could we get there sooner than maybe 5 or 6 years on our own? Yes.
Does the Bureau's proposal?
Sorry, yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just to add some more color to that, I think, excuse me, you outlined in our written submission 3 elements that would help us, in effect, do what we are going to do anyway, but faster and more affordably. So reduced roaming rates, that's obvious, reduces our cost to roam where we don't have network. Service parity, we've described it as, which seamless roaming is an attribute. If we have that, then our customers are not disadvantaged compared to the target roaming customers that are dedicated to the roaming network, and ready access to facilities. So it kind of ties together with respect to our aspirations in different parts of Manitoba, the speed with which we can do what we want to do, and how we're able to match revenues to the investment required to build those facilities.
So are you incented enough to be encouraged to purchase more spectrum in order to deploy in new areas? Or do you have your own business plan and this would be an adjunct, but it's not something that would encourage you to buy more spectrum?
Do you want to try?
How do you feel about that?
I don't think it would encourage us to buy more spectrum. As Tim has explained, it's a very important part of our business, and if we intend to be in a particular area, we're going to buy the spectrum to be there. So I don't think it'll change where we want to go and where we might purchase spectrum.
Okay. So let's assume that we do mandate wholesale MVNO access. Let's talk a little bit about what it might look like. We've talked about eligibility a little bit, and you've come down, I think, quite firmly on the notion that it should be facilities-based who operate their own mobile wireless core and serve the purpose of ensuring sustainable competition in the retail wireless market, mobile wireless market. Another limitation parties proposed was to exclude access to host carriers' domestic or international roaming agreements in the mandate. However, roaming tariffs of the national wireless carriers requires roaming partners to have access to roaming agreements of the carrier providing roaming service. Should this be any different for MVNOs, and if so, why?
Yeah, I guess we're pausing a little bit because we're probably not similarly situated to someone who's contemplating entering the business. We are already in the business and have signed our own roaming agreements. So I guess we're not as interested in obtaining that. It's not a necessity for us.
Okay. In terms of who MVNOs can sell to, is there any reason to exclude business and enterprise customers? For example, those who use machine-to-machine and Internet of Things applications?
Commercially, no. If we have an arrangement whereby we're procuring facilities that we don't own for the purpose of turning them into product and selling them, we don't see an issue with providing that to enterprise type commercial applications. I think what you might be referring to, and correct me if I'm wrong, with respect to narrowband Internet of Things and machine-to-machine interactions, our view is that whatever wholesale arrangement comes out of these decisions should not be limited just to 4G and LTE, should extend into 5G. I think my view is that part of the purpose of this proceeding is to lay down some fundamental principles that will allow people to invest in confidence in the next generation wireless networks, not just be constrained to backwards compatible technologies and use cases.
Thank you. That takes care of some future questions that I had as well. Some parties have raised concerns of entry by some of the large, well-capitalized companies as MVNOs, like large North American tech firms. In your view, is that a valid concern?
Perhaps we take a slightly different view of this than others when looking at it, and we're a little unclear whether their concern is that the new entrant is really well capitalized or whether they are non-Canadian. And it would appear the fear is more non-Canadian than capitalized, to which our respectful response is that this has already been addressed by the Government of Canada through the Telecommunications Act, through the Radiocom regulations, which say if you want to be a telecom provider, you can, in Canada, being non-Canadian, up to 10%. Once you reach the 10% threshold of the marketplace, you have to become Canadian. I'm not sure there's a reason to change that rule specifically for this.
So you don't think we even need to get to the place where we talk about whether a subscriber or market cap limit would be an appropriate way to address that concern? To you, it's cut off at the nationality level.
We are respectfully agreeing with the Government of Canada's current policy.
Many parties have suggested limiting mandated MVNO wholesale access to commercially negotiated rates backed by binding arbitration. And in addition to rates, should terms and conditions be negotiated?
Yes, we would support that.
So do you think that it would be more appropriate and less administratively burdensome to set out those standard terms and conditions at the outset, either in a tariff or decision?
I think our main concern about having those parameters fully set out in advance would be the amount of time that it might take to have proceedings to do that. And we're supporting negotiation because we think we can get that done faster. So I think it would be better if parties were enabled to go negotiate the terms of access, and perhaps the Commission could give some general guidelines about what types of terms would be considered reasonable or appropriate without having to set them all out in full detail.
Okay, so a general framework, but not too specific, not to limit you.
Well, yes, because inevitably everyone's network's a little bit different, so it would be very hard for you to prescribe in great detail the exact outcome.
In whether we mandate something or leave it up to negotiation, inevitably there is a point in these relationships where you need an arbitrator or some form of it. Do you think that that should take the form of final offer arbitration?
Again, yes, we would support final offer arbitration.
And what form do you feel that it should take? The Commission has a final offer arbitration system. Others have suggested other variations and permutations. Do you have any views on that?
Right. We did hear Shaw's answer, and it may be that the current FOA process at the Commission would need a few tweaks, but we think the Commission would likely be well placed to serve that role.
In terms of setting some of the rates, you proposed a retail minus approach. And do you think that this approach to setting wholesale rates is still reasonable given everything you've heard?
We did say that at one point on the record. That's true. We're now mostly more in favor of negotiated rates. The benefit of retail minus is that it allows the rates to evolve over time and avoids what we're seeing with domestic roaming today, where the current rates are completely out of line with where retail is. So that's something that we really want to avoid with any new services and address with respect to the current services.
Okay, so you've rethought your position on that.
Right, but there are benefits to it. And I know that the criticisms of the retail minus proposal were that it would drive up retail rates. And I'm not sure how great the risk of that is, particularly if you were considering an MVNO service that looked like the limited version that the Competition Bureau has proposed. That might be more of a risk with a full-blown resale model.
Okay, so if the retail rate and markdown was chosen, how should it be applied, given that there are umpteen plans in the market? How would you,
I don't know. guidance.
have you given that any thought? Well, it was still...
I'm not the math guy. So.
I think we're probably struggling a little bit with the answer because we really did, even when we wrote the submission, and even as we sit here now, struggle to find that answer. And we're probably not the right people to be able to answer that for you. But we, as you heard us say earlier, we acknowledge it's a balance. There has to be a balance between looking after the folks who do build the facilities and looking after those who are trying to serve the customer effectively. So regardless of which approach we took, the number we threw out of $3 to $5 per gig was triangulated from all those perspectives of saying if retail is 6 or 7 reduced, that puts it in the 3 to 5 range. If you're looking at your facilities and your costs and that, you still come up into that sort of range where you would be willing to offer that to other parties. So we're not suggesting there's a perfect answer other than, in our minds, if we were negotiating with ourselves, we would come to that number.
In your submission, you supported investment targets. How would an MVNO demonstrate that the investment that they've made actually supports their mobile wireless services?
On that one, those comments, we made those when we were discussing the proposal that Cogeco had put forward.
Okay.
We now think that a more streamlined proposal is the one that the Competition Bureau has put forward. And if you have set up the eligibility for the service, that parties that have spectrum are those who are able to access the service. Don't think you need to measure the investment in the same way like that, because the spectrum comes with an inherent demonstration of commitment to deploy, as well as conditions of license requiring you to deploy. So I don't think you need to measure the investment.
You proposed assessing investment at regular intervals. Would you rely on the existing annual reports to the Commission? Do you think that would be sufficient? Or should there be more frequent reporting?
I think it would be best to have this reported through the annual facilities survey that we do. That's well set up for this.
Keep it simple.
Yeah, we don't need
Yes.
something new.
If the Commission does mandate wholesale MVNO access, which carriers should be obligated to provide MVNO access?
I guess I get the short straw to answer that one. In approaching this, the obvious answer would be the big three who have the national element to it. But as we said, we're a facilities provider, and we're mindful of the fact that even if you started with the big three, at some point there would be a discussion about others, particularly, for example, us, in rural areas where the others might not be there, or only one of them might be there. So we're conscious of that, and this comes back to our earlier comment about you may find yourself trying to find a different solution between urban and rural to resolve that. So we'd suggest starting where everyone else would suggest you start, but we understand that that might not be the end answer.
So you aren't keen for the regional carriers, especially in the rural areas, to be considered as providers?
Well, this goes back to the rate issue. And in talking it through internally and some of the evolving thought that we've had, if you get the rate right, we should be indifferent. We should be willing to provide our network on the basis we're being adequately compensated. If you get the rate wrong, I can see why people would say, no, this is not a good thing.
But you're not ruling it out.
We are not ruling it out.
We've talked, and you've talked quite a bit in your presentation today about roaming of various kinds, and you've made, I think you've made your points very clear, and that you want 5G included in any of the regimes that result from this. What impact do you think the changes would have on the rates and terms and conditions in the tariff? Like, what do you think would happen if the current definition of roaming included 5G? What would happen to the rates?
Difficult to say, and I think the interveners previous kind of shied away from the question with respect to the potential impact of 5G. It's too early. We don't know how much it's going to cost. We don't know how much accretive revenue we're going to get. Our suggestion is don't close the door. Don't require that it only be for existing deployed technologies. Depending on the durability of policy, we're going to have 6G and something else down the road. So a mechanism whereby we can take into account the respective value of investment in future network technologies should be at least contemplated as part of this discussion. Don't freeze the policy around an existing technology, because we're going to be having this conversation again not too long from now.
Would it be appropriate to limit the scope of mandated 5G roaming to service connecting individual consumer devices, or should it be a more fulsome mandate?
Well, again, back to why would you constrain it to a particular use case or a particular market segment or a particular geography? This is a policy discussion that, in our view, should be grounded in principles, which is to develop opportunities for innovative companies that are sufficiently capitalized with an intent to develop facilities-based services, regardless of the underlying technology, regardless of how they're going to generate revenue, needs to be considered. Constraining that is going to, I think, impair the effectiveness of whatever policy we arrive at.
Bell Mobility, let's talk a little bit more about the seamless roaming side of things. Bell Mobility has suggested there are significant ongoing costs associated with implementing seamless roaming. We've heard others who've said that's not entirely the case. How would you implement such a function? How do you see that happening?
My colleague from the intervener previously, I think, outlined it very precisely and very accurately. It's really the means by which, or the mechanism by which, a mobile device communicates with different cells within a single operator's network, different cells across other operators' networks. It's a technology that exists in modern wireless deployments in every event. Yes, it's work, but it is essentially an exchange of information, a one-time configuration, and ongoing management of that configuration. It's neither expensive to set up nor necessarily expensive to maintain, and it's to the great benefit of customers on networks that are roaming onto the incumbents' networks, delivering to them service parity. Otherwise, they're disadvantaged.
to take another view of it, would seamless roaming negatively impact incentives for regional carriers to expand their networks? Might it have that kind of impact?
No.
Okay.
So because Canadians and customers would benefit. And if it was a policy that we were all subject to, then there would be no, as I've said, service parity depending on where you are and what network you happen to be attached to.
So are you suggesting mandating, or do you want this subject to negotiation?
Oh, nice.
Or a mix of the two?
We are suggesting that it is probably necessary to mandate seamless roaming at this time.
Do you see having a phase out of it?
That there would be a sunset on seamless roaming?
Mm-hmm.
No. No. This is for us, this is about a poor customer experience that doesn't need to happen. And we would certainly echo the comments of Shaw that this has been going on for 30 years and it doesn't need to continue.
We have some issue and some questions about interconnection in terms of MVNO. What do you see as the general benefits and concerns associated with single versus multi-point interconnection?
I'm not sure I understand the terms.
You're probably thinking more in terms of aggregated versus disaggregated, perhaps.
No, I'm not familiar with the context of point versus many point. To the extent it improves service reliability and gives us more commercial diversity with respect to who the providers are, it sounds like a good thing.
Let's talk a little bit, and I'm just about finished, about technology neutrality. Parties have indicated on the record that internationally, non-standalone networks will be the preferred standard for 5G networks deployment. If this were the case in Canada, would it even be possible to restrict wholesale access on the basis of network generation or technology?
So standalone versus non-standalone, the distinction is between whether you're going to have a completely sequestered, dedicated 5G network or use your existing 4G network and related spectrum and transition to 5G, just so we're all clear on what's being proposed. I'm not sure that I entirely agree with the assertion that most operators are going to go non-standalone. I think that's predominantly the case in North America, but probably not in other jurisdictions.
Well, is it premature to even look at this question? You know, I mean, is RAN the same no matter what the technology?
So that's the first part. I'm not quite sure that the assertion, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the assertion that most operators are going to go NSA. We are generally, and we have been up until now, 3GPP standards based, so we all operate in terms of how we design our equipment and establish our network interoperability against international standards bodies. That is the way forward as well for 5G. And without getting into the weeds of the specific compatibility issues and my network can't talk to yours, there will always be a way forward. I don't think it's necessarily required for us to specify that at this point. And most importantly, though, don't preclude us from being able to have the conversation with respect to introducing new technologies into wholesale roaming arrangements.
We're going to finish up with a couple of questions on looking into the future of mobile wireless. Parties have argued that network sharing arrangements between national wireless carriers provide incentives to foreclose competition from new entrants, and that these companies are unwilling to enter into network or spectrum sharing arrangements with companies other than other national wireless carriers. What are your views on the pros and cons of network sharing?
On the pros, and I think we're having these discussions, asking some very big questions, and I might add in the context of other reviews of other files, big questions to be asked, and certainly policy direction that should be established as a result of those. Pros and cons of network sharing. I think we are all dealing with legacy regimes in terms of how we have allocated public assets, spectrum amongst them, land, another one, access to civil structure, et cetera. The most efficient way for us to deploy that might be a softening or a different ownership licensing regime, I think would be benefit to Canadians generally, both in terms of accelerated delivery of services, but also in terms of leveling out and making sure that we're not overbuilding capital investments. I think there's a mechanism whereby mandated roaming can help those conversations happen. What are the cons? I think there's been lots of hand-wringing about enterprise valuations and the go-forward value of revenue streams associated with the current way of doing things, which incumbents would be rightfully defensive about. Somewhere in the middle is the right balance where we're going to continue to invest in homegrown Canadian innovation, where we're going to continue to build on the assets that we've developed, where we're going to respect property rights, for example, and maintain service and licensing continuity, but also provide a means by which innovative operators such as Xplornet have an opportunity to participate in new lines of business and new revenue streams. That, to me, is the first step of a longer journey. As soon as we button up, and I've made reference to it a few times, as soon as we button up these proceedings, we'll be on to some other technological variation and some other market pressure that we're going to need to consider. So my view, my personal view, is that the more we can anticipate what our future requirements are going to be, what kind of use cases are going to be important to our children, how are we going to use this hearing as a means by which we can start to flatten the urban-rural divide, all are important considerations beyond pros and cons of commercial arrangements for roaming.
Would we perhaps be well advised to consider what my colleague mentioned, the joint build of a 5G network, such as was done in South Korea and Germany? Well, how would that be helpful in addressing some of the challenges, or
I think it's an important question. I think it's a commercial question. I can't comment specifically on South Korean or German policy, but clearly they're motivated by some sense of getting latest technology out fast in the most economically efficient manner. I would hesitate asking regulatory agencies to instruct operators. I think to whatever extent you've got influence, provide the conditions where those conversations can be had, and possibly mandated roaming is a good place to start.
And finally, in your submissions, you supported a requirement to document and track spare capacity in addition to limitations on reservation for future use as it relates to ILEC support structures. Could you just clarify your position? Do you have anything more to add?
What I said in the comments earlier was that we don't think it's appropriate for ILECs to be able to unduly reserve capacity. It should be allocated on a first-come, first-served basis, because these are public good structures. We all can't go around putting up our own poles. So if a regional provider goes to an ILEC to ask for to be attached to their structure, that ILEC should not be permitted to say, oh, I might need that someday. You can't have that. And either force the regional provider to come back at some point in the future and ask again, or to pay for make-ready work based on, hypothetical use. It needs to be more concrete in some way. Defining that might require some further conversation. I think Shaw did a good job this morning giving some parameters around that. Maybe a 6-month window is reasonable for imminent use that might be about to take place. But we need to delineate imminent use versus hypothetical use to make sure that regional providers have efficient access to those structures.
So it sounds as though you're sort of backing off from your notion of a requirement to document this and create a registry and all of the administration that goes with that. Am I correct in surmising that you have shifted your position to one where there's some other mechanisms that could be used to?
Yeah, there's probably a
move that
simpler
along.
way to do that. But I'm not sure that. I don't know what kind of database we might need, or if we need one at all. But this space is being tracked. If someone can tell me that they're reserving it for future use, they obviously know what space is there and and when it's going to be used, right? So I'm not sure we're creating the wheel to do that. But I will back off from that. We need to track it, yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Those are all of the questions that I have.
Thank you, Commissioner Levy. I have a couple of follow-up matters, and then I'll ask the other members. Going back to the support structure issue for a second, on the issue of reserving the capacity, I guess the key thing is trying to identify what limitations would be appropriate. Would you be willing to submit by undertaking measures that you might propose then that in your view make sense? What time limits? How can we deal with the issue? You're the second party today to raise this as a particular concern, and it would be helpful to have a little more detail. So I don't know if you'll accept that as an undertaking. In particular, I guess a focus on the issue of future use, which seems to be something of a dominant theme. Is that better? Could you hear me?
Yes, we will accept that undertaking.
Thank you. You may have been in the room at the end of our questions to Shaw, and I asked about, if you will, call it a potential tweak of the Bureau's model. If carriers with existing spectrum were to become eligible for a national MVNO rather than focusing on the Tier 4 specific MVNO mandate. What do you think of that as a concept?
I think we would respond that, as per our comments, we're deliberate planners, and we don't try to boil the ocean. So the national is probably of less interest to us. We think the Tier 4 would be more appropriate because you've made a decision about what spectrum you're buying. You've looked forward, you've done your planning on that basis, and the logical next step is to be at that level.
Fair enough. Would you have a view, though, even if you didn't have that as a commercial interest, about a minimum amount of spectrum that would be a reasonable threshold, for example, to establish eligibility, for example, for such a regime?
So if I interpret your question correctly, you're asking what is a reasonable amount of spectrum that qualifies you in order to.
Thank you. You worded it better than I did.
No.
In other words, it could be a
comprehend.
problem if you sat there and go, well, I have one tower in one place. Now, can I have access to an MVNO nationally? So if one were to have such a model, presumably you'd want some threshold. I'm just wondering if you have any views on what might be a reasonable threshold.
Well, I think the answer to that is we are not supportive of the one tower and you get national. And that's in part why we are talking about the Tier 4, because we think there should be a demonstrated commitment. And by looking at it at the Tier 4 level, where you have build-out requirements and specific spectrum timelines for when you have to do things, there's a clear plan and a commitment that you can say, okay, you've got it, as opposed to, one tower in Calgary and you get to serve Montreal. Like that doesn't make sense to us.
Fair enough. Thank you. Members, other questions? Christian?
Thank you very much for your presentation and the answers to the questions. I just had one question about your proposal that following a 5-year period of MVNO access, you would want to be able to continue servicing the customers you had acquired in that original 5 years, but not be able to use the RAN access for new customers. Does that create operational issues for the underlying carrier? Like, how does that work operationally? Is that easy or difficult?
Yeah. So this was born of our reflection on, is rural different, or should we be thinking about it somewhat differently? And we could be in a situation where we're wholesaling or wholesaling from an incumbent carrier, where at the end of 5 years there would not be any, let alone service, before you get to competition. So, would rural type deployments warrant different consideration in the framework? And it was just an open question for us. At the end of 5 years, what we don't want to do is leave customers behind. And operationally, it's pretty clean for us to not allow new customers to be provisioned on somebody else's network, but still allow those customers to roam on that network. We wouldn't be wouldn't be selling on their network.
Okay, so that would be dependent upon your undertaking not to provision new customers using that RAN access.
It would be a negotiated arrangement where at some point during the term of our roaming relationship that we would no longer provision new customers on third-party network.
Okay, and is part of the benefit of that arrangement also to allow you to try and, in the first 5 years, get as much of a customer base as you can in order to help with the investment of deploying facilities?
That follows, yes.
Okay. Okay. And then I just had one other question with respect to the data rollover in your plans. Is that a data rollover that just is time limited for the following month, or does that continue?
The data rollover goes from your current month to the next month, and then it's used up first, and so it's carried over for 1 month.
Just 1 month. So if you still had an excess, that would drop off the table and you would start over at month 3 in a new position.
Just the excess of the first month.
Okay.
So say that you are on a 2 gigabyte plan, you used 1 gig in the first month, and you carried 1 over. And so in the second month, you have 3 available to you. In that second month, let's say you only use half a gig. So at the end of that month, you still have your you still have your full 2, because you had 3, right? So the full 2 that's in your plan get carried over to the third month, but you don't get the extra half a gig that came from month 1.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Commission counsel?
I just have one hopefully fairly quick question for you. You stated that in the event that there was a mandate to provide an MVNO service, that the parameters with respect to the provisioning of that service be left to negotiations. And I think you clearly indicated that it was not just rates that would be subject to negotiations, but also the terms and the conditions, and that failing successful negotiations, that there would be some form of arbitration backstop process. You may have heard me ask this question to the previous intervener, but if parties are coming into the arbitration process with divergent service proposals, how can one ensure that an FOA process will result in a just and reasonable rate if people are proposing rates on the basis of essentially a different service?
So through those negotiations, probably the terms are going to be the easier things to lock down, and we'll be bringing a few discrete clauses and a rate to you. The FOA process itself completely encourages both parties to be reasonable. So I don't think there should be a whole lot of worry about whether or not the rates that end up from that process will be just and reasonable. I think the question that you're asking that's a little bit tough is, what if each party's bringing a fundamentally different service proposal forward? How do we deal with that? I'm not sure if that would happen in practice or not, but I don't really have an answer to that one.
Well, if you look at historical negotiations around some similar circumstances, you would typically, for the same reasons that your rates, if it was just pure rates, the rates tend to come down to the incentive is you're not going to offer a crazy rate because you could lose, and the other guy's going to, you're going to try and make your rate as reasonable as possible. I would expect the same incentives to occur on the service side, that you're not going to go too crazy with the service, and most people will come to a fairly moderate middle ground with perhaps one or two things that differentiate them.
Thank you.
This well and truly is the last one now. Do you have a view on whether it would be appropriate for the Commission to reassert its powers of rate regulation over the retail market, just to the extent that it's necessary to require the provision of a low-cost plan below a certain price, say that there'd be a price ceiling there, either on the basis that competition is not providing those plans to people, or on the basis that it could be a mechanism to protect the interests of vulnerable subscribers?
Yes, we have a view. The answer to that from our perspective is we are very much competition-based, and that is our orientation. So if there is a small segment that we are concerned about from a social perspective that does not have something that meets their needs, I think we have to pause and say, is the Commission the correct place to try and solve that? Because I'm sure we can likewise point to, and certainly the Commission has decided that internet is a basic service, but that's not unlike hydro or food or other things, and perhaps the better place to address that is in the social assistance side of the world, and that we acknowledge internet is part of the things they should be considering when they're looking at the basics that humans need.
Thank you. No further questions from us, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation and your responses and your patience for a very long day. With that, we'll adjourn for today and resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Is that correct, Madam Secretary?
It's correct, at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Thank you, everyone. Good day.